And we're back in the car like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your early Tuesday evening here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Now, I have to, a sad note to open this episode. I'm sorry to be depressing, but my father passed 3 years ago today. But I don't want to keep doing these depressing episodes. I'm going to save an episode for what would have been his birthday 5 days from now. But today I want to talk movies again. And a film which, if I'm asked the question, what is the single most important documentary ever made? My answer to that question is a documentary film which was released 37 years ago today, on August 26th, 1988. The filmmaker, Errol Morris, is actually from Long Island. He grew up in Hewlett, that's the 5 towns, about as far west and south as you can go and still be on Long Island. And I know he frequented, speaking of my dad's dad, he frequented Woodmere bowling lanes in his younger days, Errol Morris that is. That's just like a little historical tidbit. But on this day, 1988, saw the release of a documentary which ended up not only changing the documentary format, but it kind of pioneered, you almost could say invented, the concept of true crime documentaries. And it is a movie that is the answer to a trivia question. Has a film ever gotten a condemned man freed from death row, where he was going to be executed for a crime he clearly did not commit, but they were going to kill him anyway, until this film came along and people who really didn't give a fuck had no choice but to follow the evidence and say, we can't go any further with this miscarriage of justice, not out of a sense of right and wrong, but out of a sense of there's too many people that know this guy was railroaded. The film is The Thin Blue Line. And I have discussed this movie on the channel before, towards the beginning of the podcast when I was just getting going. I did it as part of the Best Movie You've Never Seen series, but if I may say, I have a lot more subscribers and followers now, and I feel like this is a sort of movie that is so good and so important. It is in the National Film Registry. It was, I don't know if the right word is elected, more like selected. It was selected for the National Film Registry. That is something that's very government official, Library of Congress, and films that are of significant historical import, one way or the other, that are preserved and curated. You know, the idea, again, assuming we're all still here 100 years from now, but that the film in its, like in the original film cans, will be preserved and curated. And, you know, I'm into that sort of stuff. But The Thin Blue Line routinely ranks among the greatest documentaries ever made. And it is not the movie that Errol Morris set out to make. So Errol Morris did a couple of films in like the 70s and 80s. He did a movie called Vernon, Florida, which got a lot of acclaim. And he did a film called Gates of Heaven, which famously, and he was in the news recently, the extraordinary German filmmaker Werner Herzog, he met Errol Morris. I think they were at a premiere of one of Herzog's films. I'm not sure of that. Or maybe Herzog came to see a screening of Vernon, Florida, but Werner Herzog told Errol Morris that Gates of Heaven, that proposed documentary he had on this just ridiculous pet cemetery, horrific, ridiculous pet cemetery scandal that took place. He said that Morris was not ever going to be able to get the film made. He gave him $20, like, here's $20 towards your movie, kid. You're never going to get it made. But Werner Herzog said, and you won't get it made, but if you ever get it made, which you won't, not only will I attend the premiere of your choice, Mr. Morris, and I like your attitude and your work ethic, but I will eat my shoe at the premiere of this movie that you're not ever going to make, that you say you will, but you won't, called about pet cemeteries. And when Morris was able to actually get the financing and make this movie, which got widespread acclaim, Roger Ebert, I think, had it as his favorite, possibly his favorite documentary of all time. He said it was certainly the best film Morris made, including The Thin Blue Line, which he and his partner Gene Siskel also loved. But Werner Herzog, true to form, came to one of the premieres of Gates of Heaven and pan-fried, sauteed one of his shoes, and he didn't really get very far. He ate about 5% of it. It was inedible. It was fucking shoe leather for real. I think that was the joke. It's just like shoe leather. But it showed that Errol Morris was somebody who not only wasn't afraid to take risks, wouldn't take no for an answer, he was not afraid to change his process midstream. So Morris, sometime in the early 80s, became aware of this Dallas, Texas Police Department psychiatrist by the name of Greekson. I think his first name is John, but his name was Greekson. And what fascinated Morris has never been preoccupied with the regular, with the ordinary. He's always been fascinated with the irregular and the extraordinary. And that can mean a lot of different things and from a lot of different conceptual perspectives. So Morris had an idea that he was going to make a documentary about this psychiatrist who worked with the Dallas Police Department named Greekson. Now, that doesn't necessarily sound particularly interesting, but this particular Dr. Greekson was nicknamed Dr. Death. And ironically, Errol Morris in the 2000s did a documentary called Mr. Death, but it was not about Greekson. It was about a different guy whose job and his purpose in life appeared to be to make the most humane killing machines for states that still had the death penalty. Humane killing machines. There's a lot to unpack with that. But Dr. Death, and there was a famous wrestler, right? If you're a Gen Xer, or Steve Williams, that was his nickname, Dr. Death. And I remember the first time watching this movie, just hearing Errol Morris say the phrase Dr. Death, I thought, hey, Steve Williams. But no, Dr. Death was this guy named Greekson, this doctor. And the reason why Morris was interested is that as part of the process for a state which had the death penalty in, the 70s into the 80s, I think they still do now, but I don't think that as many condemned people get the death penalty in Texas. Could be wrong about that. I didn't double check. I apologize. But why Morris was fascinated with this guy Greekson is that he did, as part of his normal job, he would interview people on death row. And this, I do understand, not everybody on death row has a termination date. There are plenty of people on death row who live out their lives, especially if there is an idea that, well, this person is not irredeemable. This person has found God and is doing good work with some of the other inmates, whatever the case might be. This is not so unusual. So Greekson, every single person he interviewed for years, literally everyone, his prescription was, we got to kill this guy. We got to kill that guy, and this guy, and 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 that guy times 5? I don't know. Times a lot. But every single person, he said, was irredeemable beyond the point, like it's not even safe to have this guy in solitary. That is how horrendous this human being is. So Morris was fascinated by that. How can this be right? And he started working on it, and as part of his research into the Dr. Death documentary, he met a very unassuming young man who was probably in his early 30s but looked older, named Randall Dale Adams. As part of it, he interviewed a lot of people on death row, some of whom were then executed. He interviewed Randall Dale Adams, and he just was looking for some information of what was it like when he interviewed you, and what did he say, what did you say, did he do a Rorschach, all standard. He asked the same questions of all of the inmates from what I can gather. Randall Dale Adams said enough about his own situation where he's, well, what are you here for? He says, well, they say that I killed this police officer named Robert Wood, but there was a kid that I was friendly with. We had just met, and I'm pretty sure that this kid named David Harris is actually who bumped off the police officer, and it feels like I just got railroaded, that I was kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, a lot of people, right? Every man is innocent here at Shawshank. But it turns out that only Andy Dufresne was the only innocent man at Shawshank. But just because somebody says something like that, it tells a story. A condemned prisoner says that some other guy committed the murder. I mean, probably they're full of shit. But there was something in the presentation of Randall Dale Adams, and the way that in his sort of flat, resigned, I know I'm going to be executed, I didn't do it, and I'm fucked, and it's just the way that it goes. There was something in Randall Dale Adams that he just couldn't look the other way. Now, he didn't immediately say, I'm not doing this other documentary. He wanted to look into the situation to see is there any water? Does this hold water, what this guy says to me? So the more he looked into the Robert Wood murder, the more disgusted and horrified he became. Because he could not see a version of reality in which Randall Dale Adams did kill police officer Robert Wood. Like it was a 0%. It wasn't, well, maybe he didn't. It was, there's no way he did it. So Morris scrapped the Greekson project, the Dr. Death project, and he began collating and getting research together and conducting interviews with people connected to the Robert Wood murder on the side of the police and the state of Texas, various judges who were involved, attorneys who were involved. The thing with Morris, we know that he believed that Randall Dale Adams did not commit the murder. We know that. But he wasn't trying to tilt the documentary. He gave everyone a forum. And the reality is, the Dallas Police Department comes off really bad. The judge involved in the original case seems like a fucking moron. Even though you're like a high IQ imbecile, he knew that it was dirty. It's all bad. But he just lays it out there and paints this compelling picture of a guy who was framed. They didn't mean to frame this guy. It's a tragedy that police officer was killed. But they were, the Dallas Police Department was in such a rush to clear the case because they had some incredible run of cases, of murder cases that they had gotten convictions on that they had cleared. And David Harris was, I believe, underage. He could not have been charged with a capital crime. And Randall Adams could. Now, what I just said, I want you to think about what I just said there and take a moment and reflect on how bad that is. That we don't know who committed the murder, but since we could get the death penalty, we're going to pin it on this guy. This is literally what happened. And Randall Adams, early in The Thin Blue Line, says words to the effect of, people ask me about hell on earth, and all I say is Dallas, Texas. So Greekson is in this film. He's in the documentary, but more as a side character, as the person who interviewed Randall Adams and said, this guy is so bent. He's so irredeemable. Like, he made it seem as if Adams was worse than people who had killed 10 people. He just was full of shit. I mean, give me a break. So what Morris did that also was different, and we talk about true crime documentaries and true crime documentary series. We've all seen many of them. Some are better than others. But what Morris did that was not and had not been done even by the great documentarians of the day, of course, Michael Moore still working, and Barbara Koppel, who did Harlan County, which is still one of the most famous documentaries and kind of groundbreaking in its way. But Morris did recreations. Yes, all of the interviews with the principals, Randall Adams, David Harris, who we assume is the guy who actually killed Robert Wood, people connected to the police department, the case, the prosecution team, witnesses who were paid to lie on the stand. We hear from them, but we also see the killing of Robert Wood, but we don't actually see the killing. We see recreations depending on who's telling the story. And in the immortal words of the late great screenwriter William Goldman, we see the killing recreated depending on which lie this person told versus which lie that person told versus this is probably what really happened. And so the film, as a documentary, it unfolds like a thriller. It has the Rashomon style, and I'm sorry if you don't get that reference. It's the famous Akira Kurosawa film where we see an incident and we think, well, this is what happened. But no, this is what happened according to this person. But then we see the same incident according to that person and this person and that person and this person. And that is how this film plays out. So when The Thin Blue Line was released, when it opened on this day, 1988, most critics were over the moon. We've never seen a documentary like this. And as I said, Roger Ebert, although he didn't love this movie as much as Gates of Heaven, which he said, Roger Ebert literally said, Gates of Heaven is one of the greatest movies ever made. So if you ever wanted to see a film that the late great himself, Roger Ebert, said is one of the greatest movies ever made, Gates of Heaven. But Ebert loved The Thin Blue Line. He didn't necessarily think that it should have won the best documentary Oscar for release, films released in '88, but he loved it. And I think Siskel was even more bullish on it. Siskel just thought it was phenomenal. But when it came time for the Academy Awards, because this was a different documentary, there had not been a documentary released that had recreations. So it's a dichotomy. It's a fair, not only comparison, but to discuss when you talk about documentary film, because I love Michael Moore. I think Roger and Me is the most entertaining documentary ever made. It's hilarious, but it tells a really horrifying, harrowing story while still being very entertaining and very funny. Now, Michael Moore played with the facts in terms of the timeline of events is not the way that he lays it out in that film. And that some people took issue with that. And that's probably why Roger and Me did not win Best Documentary, but Moore ended up winning Best Documentary for Bowling for Columbine, and he's made a lot of other just incredible, just fantastic films. But because of the recreations, despite the fact that this is very clearly a documentary, this is not a feature film. Everyone who was interviewed was part of the Randall Adams case, the Robert Wood murder. Everyone was part of it. The recreations, the committee that selects the best documentaries for the Oscars, back then, it's the same now, but obviously different people all these years later, they more or less disqualified The Thin Blue Line. They weren't even allowed to nominate it. Nowadays, this sort of documentary, if the committee thinks it's worthy, they could. But again, this was a groundbreaking film. Nobody had done true crime like this. No one had done these recreations. And one of the other masterstrokes is, and I don't know how this happened, but Errol Morris managed to get Philip Glass, then is now among the top 10 greatest living composers of film music, to do the score. And you may know the name, you may not know, but one of his most famous scores, Philip Glass, is the score for the original Candyman from 1992. It elevates the film. I mean, the movie to me is a 9 out of 10, but Philip Glass score makes it a 10 out of 10. It's that good and that perfect for the material. But some of Glass's other compositions were used in The Truman Show. If you remember the famous scene from The Truman Show where Jim Carrey is reaching a point where he knows something is fucked, but he can't quite figure it out. The world revolves around him, but how and why? The scene where he accidentally stumbles onto what is like a film set. It doesn't make sense. You got guys having coffee. This is supposed to be an elevator. What am I doing here? Well, you weren't supposed to go into that building, bro. That's what you're doing here. But the music that plays when he puts his briefcase up to stop the bus, compositions by Philip Glass. And there are a number of different major famous moments in the film that were scored by Philip Glass. I don't think specifically for this movie. I think that they used pieces that were originally for other films, like I think he did music for Mishima, among others. But Glass's music in the world of The Thin Blue Line, I mentioned how it plays like a thriller, and I'm telling you, if you're not familiar with this film, there are going to be moments in this movie where you almost feel like you're watching a horror movie or a suspense thriller. That is how riveting the story, when it really ratchets up, because the film opens, it doesn't feel like a mystery. Randall Adams is in prison, he's on death row. And then we kind of unpack everything that happened getting him there, and then showing this man is innocent. We can't let this continue. We can't let this stand. We can't kill this guy who quite clearly didn't commit a crime. And I had mentioned on the podcast, and I made an error. I thought that the reason why Dallas did not even look into charging David Harris, the kid that most likely committed the murder, was because he was known to the police, and that he had a couple of family members that were kind of important people in the town. I didn't want to mess with that because they weren't sure. But it was the age factor, and this is not a criticism. I don't necessarily, I'm not on board with a 16 or 17-year-old person getting a chair. I'm not looking at that, but that should not be the primary function. If you think that a 17-year-old kid committed a murder and you don't think you can do anything other than send him to juvie hall, you still can't prosecute the wrong guy. You can't do that, and that's what they did. So when the film came out and got tremendous critical acclaim, and there were many critics already saying this is the greatest documentary ever made. And bear in mind, The Times of Harvey Milk had come out in 1985. That is a great, great movie. That is also incredibly powerful from an emotional standpoint. And what just a travesty, a miscarriage of justice on top of the awfulness of Moscone and Harvey Milk getting assassinated. Like, that's all bad. The Thin Blue Line paints a similarly horrifying story, but more a story of a gross miscarriage of justice. So I mentioned how Errol Morris pivoted from what had to be a significant disappointment of not even getting an Oscar nomination for this. So he did another a film very well remembered, another movie that Ebert thought was a masterpiece called Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control, sometime in the 90s. I'm not sure what year. And that was a film that at various points almost feels like it could have aired on PBS because it has a very quirky feel, but you realize why Morris fixates and focuses on these particular people, because they are people who are trying to do things that are against nature. You know, life finds a way. Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park, he could be talking about these people here. You have a lion tamer, and a lion is so unruly that if this guy loses focus for a quarter of a second, he's going to get killed. But he's a lion tamer. And then you have a guy who has this topiary garden where he has to work on it for about 8 hours every day to keep it looking exactly as he wants it to look. He is going against nature. And then there's a guy, a scientist, who decides that he's going to prove that the naked mole rat, what was the thing with the naked mole rat? Can the naked mole rat, does it have hair? Does it not have hair? I forgot what the mechanics were, but this guy spends years of his life trying to prove something that people were telling him from the beginning. This can't be proven. You're just going to waste your time, and that's exactly what he did. I don't remember the guy with the naked mole rat was a really interesting looking dude. But Morris ended up winning an Oscar in 2003. And I'm sorry, I'm going to get a little political. You're probably on the 22-minute mark. I'm going to lose a lot of subscribers here, but not in the way that you think. But in 2003, Errol Morris put out a movie featuring extensive interviews with Robert J. McNamara, who had been the United States Secretary of Defense. And from a certain point of view, he was kind of considered the architect of the clusterfuck, otherwise known as the Vietnam War. And it's a somewhat sympathetic portrait of McNamara, who was well into his 80s and still sharp as a tack. And you could tell that this is a guy whose IQ is probably 160 or 170. He's no just imbecile who blundered into stuff. He had very specific ideas in the 60s, and now in the early 2000s, he's falling on his sword and basically saying, you know, we thought that it was really important to stop the spread of communism. We were wrong. You know, like, tough shit. What are you going to do? But Morris ended up winning the Best Documentary Oscar that year for The Fog of War, and he went on stage, got a big, big hand. Now, you could say that some of his movies had been controversial, but not in the manner of Michael Moore. So Morris winning was seen as the Academy finally saying, this is probably our best living documentarian, and this movie is fantastic. We had to reward him. So it was great. That was the highlight for me of that those Academy Awards, was getting to see Long Island native get up on stage and, you know, and take home an Oscar. And he even joked, he says, I finally see, I guess you like my films after all. You know, he got a few laughs and whatnot. But The Thin Blue Line right now, before I forget, is streaming free on Tubi, which is a completely free app. You have to deal with some commercials, but not a significant amount of commercials. And if you get AMC Plus, it's streaming on AMC Plus. There was actually a copy on YouTube for a while, but that was taken down. And the movie has been on Netflix at various points in time, but I think it was on as recently as about 4 or 5 months ago, but not anymore. But Tubi, as I say, is a free app, so you can easily get into it. But when the film was released, as I mentioned, I'm sorry, I always get sidetracked. There was such a furor, in this context, a good kind of a furor, where people saw it and said, what's the status of the Randall Dale Adams case? What's going on? And people were so angry, and there were so many threatening phone calls, and so many people in Dallas who had to kind of come to Jesus, like, we can't let this happen. There were people not many, but some who were willing to have their mind changed. This is something you don't see that much now. Once you're entrenched in a certain position, you ain't moving off your spot. But in this case, there were people connected to, like the Dallas, Texas Board of Appeals and the parole board that said, we have to get Morris's conviction vacated before they kill him. This can't be allowed to continue. So fortunately, Morris's conviction, I don't know specifically if it was overturned or vacated or both. Again, I should have known that, but the gist of it was his conviction was thrown out and he was free. He never should have been incarcerated in the first place. He didn't commit the murder. Again, you want to do an Andy Dufresne thing where Andy Dufresne was, spoiler alert, we're pretty sure he didn't commit those murders. Otherwise, the Shawshank Redemption, that wouldn't be the title of the movie. They'd have to come up with something else. But The Thin Blue Line, my pick for the most important documentary film ever made, and certainly in the top 10 to this day, greatest documentaries ever made for the groundbreaking filmmaking techniques of Morris, the fact that it actually changed history by a man who would have simply been executed and no one would have known. Nobody would have been the wiser because the ruling class in Dallas, Texas just didn't give a fuck. I mean, how craven, how horrendous can you be that you don't care that you're sending an innocent man to his death? It's literally what happened. Were it not for the efforts of Errol Morris working tirelessly and a lot of the people that put Randall Adams on death row getting to say their piece, and we're like, this person is full of shit, that person is full of shit, and this person doesn't know which end is up. They just, I guess, got paid enough money to say whatever they were told to say. The Thin Blue Line, directed by Errol Morris, released on this day, August 26th, 1988. A landmark, groundbreaking, true crime documentary. This has been episode 599, we're getting there, of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your Tuesday early evening here with me in New York. And if you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.